Thank you very much. And thank you, Julian, for such a candid, direct talk. I think I'm never going to look at sandcastles in the same way again. So my name's Georgia. I'm a partner at Index Ventures. I sit in our European office, and I spend a lot of my time thinking about and investing in marketplaces. And I really fell in love with this category, having started my career off at Deliveroo. And there were really 3 seminal moments for me during my time there that sort of drove this love affair. And the first one was actually how I came across the business. So back at university, I was tasked with writing a long essay about any business in any category doing anything interesting. And because of my love of food, Deliveroo was a pretty obvious one to write about. And the business was about a year or so old at the time. And in studying this business and really learning from first principles, I really came to appreciate just what a beautiful business model marketplaces are. And in that, I mean, there's no inventory, there's huge synergistic value when you look at all stakeholders within the marketplace. And because you're typically aggregating supply in a way that demand would have struggled to get access to, there's just this amazing kind of goodwill and latitude when it comes to the demand side. So I fell in love with the business model. I joined the business, and about a week into joining, I started going into these different towns and cities across the UK to launch Deliveroo. And it was there doing, cold walk-ins and cold calls with restaurant owners. Did the second thing really strike me about marketplaces? And that is, you can build the most beautiful business model in the world and use the most beautiful technology in the world. But really, your product and your value proposition needs to make sense to the user. And that I was talking to these restaurant owners and asking them to change their workflow. And unless that meant more frictionless, easy to understand, and crucially made them money, the rest was futile. And that's what I really love about marketplaces, is that ultimately it's people first, technology second. And in my opinion, the best marketplace businesses never lose sight of that. And finally, sort of my final seminal moment was actually after launching my first market and in a cab back to the station and seeing a Deliveroo rider sort of whiz past. And as they were whizzing past, I had an inbound email from a restaurant who had a few weeks ago told me to go away and please stop bothering them. And it felt like at that moment I was seeing network effects in the flesh and this beautiful organic growth loop that drives a lot of these outlier marketplaces, which is really what I'm here to talk to you about today. So I'll talk a little bit about who we are, just to demonstrate the perspective at which we're coming at this from. I'll then go on to how we've built our thesis in this space, and then we can drill down into these core buckets when we think about what we look for when we're evaluating a marketplace and thinking about it as an investment opportunity. So first, who we are. So I think there are probably 3 relevant data points to highlight about Index to demonstrate the perspective that we're coming at this from. So the first is we're a global fund. So we like to think we open an office every decade. So in London, in San Francisco, and in New York. We also have presence in Germany as well as Tel Aviv. And why is that relevant when we think about marketplaces? Well, typically there's obviously local marketplaces and global marketplaces. And at our vantage point, we're able to see the nuances between and the pattern recognition across these different geographies. And this helps us assess whether there are certain structural factors in one market that apply or don't apply in another. So that's the first piece. We're global. The second fact is we're a long-term partner to the companies that we work with. So a lot of our most well-known portfolio companies, we actually led the seed round and multiple rounds after that. Again, why is that relevant in the case of this talk? Well, we've seen the different paths and the different stages that a business goes through. And as a result, we're far less fixated on a certain set of metrics to indicate readiness for next round or good or bad KPIs, but rather we see that a lot of journeys take a lot of different forms. And crucially, a lot of the businesses that no doubt some of you guys are building, you're doing it for the first time, in a market for the first time. And therefore, benchmarks can only be so useful. So that's the second thing. And the third thing, we have more than a decade of experience backing and scaling marketplaces. So the likes of Etsy, Farfetch, Deliveroo, Goat, and a lot more. And as a result, we've had the privilege of working with a lot of fantastic entrepreneurs and seen both the challenges they've faced, but also the opportunities they've unlocked. And really, it's sort of reflecting on what we've seen in the past that prepares us for what we'd expect in the future. And when we think about the evolution of marketplaces, we distill it down to 4 key phases. some of which I'm sure a lot of you in the room will be well versed on when it comes to this notion of unbundling. So the first sort of Act 1 is the very broad, horizontal, predominantly B2C marketplaces. So that's the eBay, the Craigslist, the Amazons of this world. And really, these marketplaces are sort of everything to everyone. And as a result, they grew super fast because they have this amazing network effects. But the downside was there was a limit to which they could build out tailored functionality. And so this gave rise to Act 2. And these were vertical solutions coming out of broad-based horizontal platforms. So the Etsy's, the Goats, the Airbnbs of this world. And what was so exciting about Act 2 wasn't just because they siloed a piece of the horizontal marketplace and built a business out of it, but actually that a lot of these businesses ended up being bigger than the very platforms they emerged from. And then similarly, you see somewhat of a similar dynamic in Act 3 on the B2B side. So you have a rising sort of millennial expectations within the workforce, and you see again these broader, more horizontal platforms emerging targeted around B2B. Now, I'm aware Alibaba is on the B2B side, and obviously a lot of its revenue comes from B2C. However, interestingly, this business actually started as a B2B platform, and a meaningful amount of its profits are still driven from the B2B side today, particularly in international markets. So anyway, ultimately, this sets the scene for what we're describing as Act 4. And I'd put Act 4 into two categories. So the first is, in a similar notion to B2C, where you see these vertical use cases coming out of these broad-based B2B marketplaces. And then there's a separate category, which I really want to hone into today, and that's actually online platforms emerging from industries that have not been served by any online platform before. And crucially, what's exciting about this category is that the challenge is harder when you think about adoption, but the size of the prize is larger because you're not even disrupting an incumbent. And when we talk about Act 4, we sort of can't, not address the elephant in the room, which is why hasn't there been enough scaled, successful B2B marketplaces yet, particularly when the size of the prize is larger and the opportunity is even greater. And this is very much an illustrative market map of some of the companies we've observed in Europe. But really, when you think about the standout success stories, the few of them are concentrated in the US, be that Ariba, Grainger, Cooper, etc. And as you can see here, although there's a lot of early stage activity, we're yet to see sort of the breakouts. So the question becomes, why now? Why do we think that now the world is ready for Act 4? And really, at Index, we feel that the sort of compounding effect of both COVID and macro context means that now is the time for verticalized B2B marketplaces to start emerging at scale. And really, we'd distill this down to three different pillars when we think about the why now and the preconditions to make this happen. The first is infrastructure. So to put it simply, we can build products that 5-10 years ago we would have been able to build before. And that ranges from the shift to API-driven architecture, more integrated payments and lending, and more seamless shipping infrastructure. And so crucially, the value proposition that these products are offering are by order of magnitude stronger than they used to be. So that's infrastructure. The second one, which I think is particularly exciting and pretty revealing, is attitude. So these graphs are taken from a report that McKinsey published earlier this year. They interviewed about 600 different B2B suppliers. And crucially, as you can see on the top one, e-commerce has finally overtaken in-person channels as a more popular channel. Now, why I think this is particularly exciting is this isn't just a change of habit. People are used to selling from their desk or not having to go into person to sell. Actually, as you can see from the second graph, e-commerce is believed to be a more effective sales channel than in-person. And what's crucial about this is that these sellers are crucially seeing the value in the products that they're using, and are therefore far more receptive when it comes to engaging with new technology and new forms of infrastructure. And finally, it's a topic that we've already touched on today, but just this sort of much broader and much more sort of increasing urgency when it comes to awareness. And I'd put this down to two things. So firstly, just the breakdown of different supply chains and people understanding both the importance and the complexity of them. And secondly, just the escalating climate crisis. And this is actually a map showing the different materials from the different geographies that's made up of a self-adhesive tape, which still, by the way, qualifies to be classified as made locally. And this map was built by a portfolio company of ours, Sourceful, which I'll talk about later. But it really shows just how complex these supply chains are, and that even when moving them online, they're still complicated to trace. So we need to move and understand this from a digital perspective in order to have better traceability and efficiency. And so the time is now. What are we looking for? I'm going to talk about 4 different buckets when we think about how we identify outliers at index. And the first is market. And so we're going to talk about different market characteristics that we tend to find compelling when we're evaluating business. So the first one, it's got to be a massive industry. And again, just to put a little bit of rationale and kind of back of the envelope maths to this. So obviously, with any marketplace, you can only capture a certain market share at a certain commission. And when we look at it from an investing perspective, we've got to build a case that the business we're investing in is returning our fund. And the latest fund we raised was $3 billion. And if you think about our average ownership, it's probably between the 10 to 20%. So ultimately, it doesn't take long to realize that the businesses that we look to back, we have to believe that they're going to be able to grow and, crucially, be operating in industries that are deep, that are large, and that are still growing. So that's the industry. Number 2, low digital penetration. And by that, we mean that the experience or workflows can be, by order of magnitude, improved by bringing something online. Number 3, high fragmentation. And I think there are 2 relevant points to point out there. First, there's value in aggregating the supply side. And secondly, so you're not held hostage to a certain larger, more concentrated player that you end up running against a brick wall. 4, relationship-driven network effects. And this is particularly relevant when we think about vertical B2B marketplaces, because often we see relationships be more concentrated and sort of more embedded. But that's really exciting to us, because what it often means is if one goes, others will follow. And so you get this beautiful growth loop. And finally, high-frequency transactions. We need to see that kind of stickiness and high liquidity in order to build a sustainable platform. And appreciate this can all sound kind of quite conceptual, so I thought it would be helpful to anchor this in actually some real-life examples that we've invested against at Index. And the first example is a business called Motorway. It's actually a C2B marketplace based in the UK. And what it essentially enables consumers to do is to sell their cars direct to dealers without trading off on price or experience. So as a consumer, you're getting the best price for your car because dealers are bidding against each other to compete for that car. And you're not having to take a long time or drive into a dealer to do a trade-in, versus you just make a profile on the app, and instead of posting an ad out on Auto Trader, it's very quick and seamless. So consumers don't have to trade off on price and experience, and for dealers, it's enabling them access to privately owned cars. Now, that's the business model, but what specifically stuck out to us about the market? First of all, obviously, it's huge, even within the domestic market. So 100 billion pounds worth of cars is traded annually. Secondly, 5% of cars are sold online, so there's a lot of room to meaningfully improve the experience. Obviously, we know that there's huge fragmentation on the consumer side, so you see about 8 million used cars being traded every day. But crucially, the 12,000 dealers told a lot for us, because if you look into that dealer segment, there's some really nice fragmentation and a long tail of solo entrepreneurs, small to medium business owners. They're not can only be enabled by this type of platform, but it means that Motorway isn't held hostage to a certain dealership in order to continue to grow their business. Fourthly, in terms of organic dealer acquisition, so again, where some will go, others will follow. And I think this is really important, because what this told us is, like with any marketplace that we invest in, our thesis is if you find the right supply, demand will come, and that it's all about supply, supply, supply. And this was a really compelling stat to us, because what it meant was Motorway was finding the right supply, which in this case was privately owned cars, and dealers were coming organically to the platform. And finally, the premise of the business model is that there's these 24-hour live auctions. And what's really exciting about this is you have, from a consumer side, high intent to sell, and from a dealer side, because this is their day-to-day, high intent to buy. And as a result, you get this amazing liquidity and sell-through rate. So actually, right now, every 4 minutes, a car is sold through Motorway, just to give a sense of scale. So that's Motorway. I'm going to put it into a completely other different market, again, to show how we look for these different hallmarks and characteristics. So this is Rusa. This is a fish and seafood trading platform, and they essentially connect the processors to the wholesalers. So for those of you who don't know, because I certainly didn't know before I met the Rusa team, the processors are the ones who are filleting, smoking, preparing the fish, and then obviously the wholesalers are the ones who are selling to restaurants, supermarkets, grocery stores, etc. So again, going through these different characteristics. So it's a 140 billion euro market in Europe annually. So that's the amount of fish and seafood that are traded. Crucially, there isn't even a number for the level of digital penetration, which just shows how offline this market is. And I was so struck when we were looking at this investment and doing so many customer calls, how often the word fax appeared in terms of when people were talking through their workflow. And by faxes, I mean every day getting faxes with fish stock and different prices. And it really told us just by order of magnitude how much better this experience could be if it was brought online. Thirdly, again, high fragmentation. So here you have around 4,000 processors and 40,000 wholesalers. But crucially, there was like another layer of fragmentation here, and that is this sort of local geography component. So obviously, different types of fish are fished out of different types of sea, and those are spread all across Europe. So you have another layer, which again brings value in aggregating it and enabling certain parts of the world to access other parts of the world. Again, given wholesalers at the demand side, we wanted to see organic wholesale acquisition. If you get the right supply, demand will come. And this is the same as we were talking about with Motorway. And finally, a dynamic that we were really excited by when it came to this market. And again, we only learned by learning about this market. So I'm sure there are a lot of different other cases where this also holds true. Obviously, fish have a fixed shelf life, and the longer they're out the water for, so it's average 6 days if they're not frozen, the less price they can fetch. So you have this amazing incentive for suppliers to be pushing stock. But unfortunately, because this transaction is so inefficient and offline, for every 3 fish that are taken out the water, only 2 make it to your plate. So you have this sort of perfect storm where it's super high liquidity in this kind of frantic, slightly chaotic trading environment. And then you also have this huge inefficiency, which is resulting in huge amounts of waste, and really in the backdrop of the macro context we were talking about, needs to be changed. So again, a completely different market, but having these types of characteristics. And crucially, if the market has these types of characteristics, we'd expect to see these types of trends within traction. So the first is efficient sales cycles. So the benefit of building out verticalized, whether it's B2C, B2B, whatever, the benefit of being within a specific category is that you can drive word of mouth quicker, you can leverage the relationships you have, and therefore, as a result, on at least one side of the market, we tend to see very efficient sales cycles. The second is high GMV net retention. So this is showing us that people are coming back and spending more and more on the platform over time. And again, this kind of goes back to the people first, technology second, that people are really seeing the value immediately and returning, and that it's not a leaky bucket by any stretch. And thirdly is high engagement rate. Now, obviously, the frequency of transaction probably does depend on the market, but you still want to see both supplier and demand side engaged. And that's whether it's checking for stock or searching or whatever it may be within a certain category to show us that we're building a sticky product. So that's traction. But ultimately, traction is only down to product. And I'm a little bit hesitant to talk too much about products or sort of make overly generic statements here, because conscious if we're talking about underserved and overlooked categories with all sorts of different industries, the products are going to vary to a nth degree. We're also at Index very hesitant to sort of make any kind of direction on product or dictate any particular functionality should or shouldn't be there, because as VCs, we know we are very much not the closest to product, and that founders and teams and customers are much closer. But that being said, there are some characteristics and trends that we've observed with products we've seen in the past that we really like when we're looking at this category. And the first is intuitive. If you think about a lot of these markets, you probably have a low digital savviness, a lot of the time an older demographic. And crucially, to get through the door, it has to make immediate sense. You don't want to learn how to use it, you just want to be able to use it. So we look for an intuitive front end. Meanwhile, on the back end, what's really exciting and what ultimately builds a moat over time is if the back end is solving a hard data problem. And this is particularly relevant here when we talk about marketplaces, because I think a lot of industries that we look at, people may ask, well, why can't you build a vertical SaaS instead of a marketplace? Vertical SaaS, arguably a better business model, higher margins, yada, yada, yada. And what we say is that, yes, you can build a vertical SaaS, but ultimately, if you build a marketplace, you are closest to the transaction. And as a result, you're closest to the supplier's product data. And this is really valuable when you think about how you can build more of a meta layer when it comes to attribution and product selection, and ultimately driving over time better traceability, efficiency, conversion, recommendations, etc. And that really becomes not only a moat from a go-to-market perspective, but also from a product roadmap perspective over time. So we really like to see a back-end solving a hard data problem. And finally, and this is a pretty well-versed concept within this space, is that a lot of particularly B2B products move beyond just discovery. So they're very much enabling an end-to-end transaction, whether it's searching, matching, bulk buying, financing, logistics, etc. And again, just anchoring this in a real-life example. So Sourceful is another business that we recently backed at Index. It's essentially a sustainable supply chain platform, and it enables brands to find, design, and fulfill packaging. And again, going through those 3 different pillars. So firstly, it has a super intuitive front end. So think about it a little bit like a 3D Figma, a 3D design studio. And instead of product designers or brand owners trawling through Alibaba and trying to understand different supplier vettings and then going back and forth on email with different samples. This is a very much all-in-one studio where designers can both visualize and customize their packaging requirements and crucially have a live scoring of both price and carbon impact. So that's the intuitive front end. You don't need to teach people to use how to use the platform. It's just intuitive. Meanwhile, on the back end, what they're doing is actually super hard. So they're going and they're finding manufacturers both in China and the UK. They're ingesting their blueprints, and they're building a proprietary LCA database, not on a category level, but actually on a per product level. And this is a great example, right? So this is a mailer box, and you can see the breakdown of different materials in different geographies. And all this data complexity on the back end is driving this live carbon scoring on the front end. And ultimately, over time, is really exciting when we think about the traceability of our supply chains and the opportunity to build this into other areas that isn't just packaging, but rather going down into the product stack. And finally, they have an auto stock feature. So this is very much an end-to-end, all-in-one experience for brands. So they do both the inventory management and the fulfillment. So brands, again, are doing sort of minimal uplift and having more of an end-to-end enablement. And ultimately, when we think about the best products, at least what we've seen at Index, is that it's always down to the best founders and founders who have an insight into the problem that they're building for. And if there was one characteristic that we could pick out when we thought about the marketplaces that we backed, is that these founders have domain expertise. And that probably means 2 things. 1, they have a proprietary insight into what they're building. Or 2, they have strong relationships and networks that really kickstart their go-to-market. So Jack Conte is a great example of this. So he was in a band with his then girlfriend, now wife, called Pomplamoose. And they were getting a ton of hits on YouTube, but really just couldn't make any money to spend more time on their passion and had to do a day job on the side. And that was the stimulus for building Patreon, which obviously enables creators to monetize their craft and leverage their audience. Or Jose is another great example. So Jose actually launched a shoe store and then also a boutique. And only as a boutique owner and seeing the opportunity to move online did he end up launching Farfetch. And that's really the note I want to end on, because ultimately when we think about the characteristics we've walked through, arguably they're not even exclusive to marketplaces. And often, great businesses can pave the way for different types of business models and functionalities, be that vertical SaaS, fintech, even native AI. And Shopify is a great example of this. They started out as essentially being an e-commerce layer for brands, and now they have a marketplace. They do payments, they do fulfillment, they do logistics. Toast is another great example. Started as a cloud-based POS system and have about 15 products now, from booking to loyalty, etc. And if there's one thing that we have kind of huge conviction in here at Index, it's ultimately the most exceptional founders don't just capture, but create new categories. So we're really excited to see sort of the next wave of vertical marketplaces in underserved and overlooked categories emerge, and all the products, businesses, teams, and founders that come with them. And thank you very much for listening.
Do we have any questions? Questions for Georgia? Anyone? Or was it all super clear? No questions?
Great.
Oh, there you go.
I'm not sure if it's really a good question, but I was just wondering, based on your presentation, you talk about the sales cycles and that they should be efficient. Okay, sure. So I was wondering, just something that went through my mind, you were talking about the sales cycles, and you said they should be efficient. So how would you define an efficient sales cycle? That you have the process in a clear, in a clear view, that you know how to execute sales, or should it be short, or could you maybe define that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So it goes back to the point of probably on a per market basis, it varies in terms of length of time, right? If you're dealing with certain stakeholders, I'm sure it's if I think about delivery, you could probably get a restaurant on within 2 weeks. But if I think about other industries, I'm sure it'll be much longer. I think what we mean by efficiency, it's how much you're paying in terms of time and investment versus how much you're getting out, versus necessarily a length of time. Does that make sense? Great.
I was wondering, because you're looking for industries that are basically pre-digital, so you're expecting from the companies to digitalize a whole industry, and then combined with the long sales cycle that requires, let's say, patient capital. How do you reconcile that with the VC model, right? Like that whole process will take probably longer than a couple of years. So how do you deal with that aspect?
Yeah, it's a great question. And look, I think, if I was to kind of pull up the second slide we went to in terms of looking at some of our kind of outlier success stories, they definitely didn't take a couple of years either, right? Figma is a great example. So they didn't bring a product to market until about 3-4 years in, just to give an idea of, having invested in the seed, then kind of what we went through with that journey. So, I agree with you. I think, particularly in light of this environment and what has been discussed earlier, it's actually a great time to build a business that does take longer. And realistically, the size of the prize is larger, even if the initial hurdle is longer. And I think that's why we like having more of a multi-stage approach, because we're less fixated on a certain metric to make it ready for a next round when we may lead. A lot of the time we're looking at, frankly, how the team is hiring and how they're executing versus whether they're ready for a next round or not.
Italy, and I have a question about geography. We have spoken about different aspects you're looking at. What is your real life experience about the European fragmentation of geographies, languages, currencies, cultures, as opposed to English speaking, which looks easily maybe towards United States, which is a larger, more uniform, more homogeneous, and maybe faster to grow market? Just your comment on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And obviously, so half the team are based in Europe and half the team based in the US. We spend a lot of time thinking about the kind of differences between, sort of complements, etc. I think a couple of things. So I think Europe's well positioned for a number of business models actually better than the US, or a number of types of businesses better than the US. I think climate infrastructure is a perfect example of this, that we're kind of, can you hear me? climate businesses. So given how much sort of further ahead we are when it comes to awareness and the types of technology we're building, that's one. Another, it was back in the day, but it sort of drove the thesis in our MySQL investment was that one of the sort of earliest, best open source companies have to come out of Europe, given the kind of socialist background that we have. So I think there are a lot of nuances within different geographies that actually better position it for building new businesses. And then obviously, US, if we think about a lot of the direct-to-consumer businesses, it's arguably much easier to sort of launch in multiple areas there versus have to account for the different geographies. So as a result, we always kind of be thinking about that when we're thinking about the various different types of investments.
Hi. Hi. How do you assess the ability of B2B marketplaces to compete against often existing, entrenched, long-lasting relationship between customers and suppliers? Often I feel sometimes B2B marketplaces are offering, let's say, speed and discovery, even on a very fragmented market. But I don't know, I mean, this is not always a super interesting value proposition for customers in some B2B markets where speed is not key, for instance.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it goes back to that when you look at a product and what it has to offer, it has to be, first of all, not just about discovery, because a lot of suppliers and customers will be familiar with each other. And therefore, whether it's the lending or logistics or fulfillment, there has to be other functionalities that make it a significantly better workflow and experience than there was, and whether that's saving them time, money, whatever it may be. But I think that all comes down to the product, really.
Okay, we'll do one more question if there's one that is there. Cool, in the back.
Hi there, thank you very much for the presentation. In the introduction this morning, there was a couple of insights into sort of what areas of marketplaces are sort of being potentially the most exciting. And in your talk, you kind of covered on some really good examples about where Index have done this sort of historically and the outcomes in that. Index are obviously a fund where I imagine you're doing a lot of market mapping and sort of what you're sort of looking at next. So for you, what are the sort of emerging trends and sort of, say, your top 3 subsectors of marketplace that's going to really excite you over the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we approach it slightly differently at Index. And by that I mean, when we're developing a thesis, we think less around, okay, we're looking for a business in this market, but versus we're looking for these types of characteristics. And regardless of the market, it's around meeting the right founders who are building within these categories that have these characteristics. So to take an example, we weren't looking for a car investment and then found Motorway. We found Motorway and crucially the founding team there, and then we pegged it against these different characteristics that we get excited about. The same is for fish and seafood. I would love to say that I had any idea about the fish and seafood market before meeting Joel, Erez, and Nico, but I didn't. But what we did have was a pre-prepared kind of structure of how we'd think about the market that then made building that investment case much more efficient. Does that make sense?
If I adapt the question slightly, what new characteristics are you seeing sort of post-pandemic world versus what you previously might have done over the last 5-10 years?
Yeah. I think we're seeing a lot on the kind of climate infrastructure space, definitely. A lot on more kind of commodities style kind of exchanges. Again, really speaking to a lot of these more sort of sleepy, nascent areas that off the back of COVID have been catalyzed to adopt new technologies.